You're about to get hit with the biggest council tax shock in decades, and most people have absolutely no idea it's coming. While you've been dealing with rising energy bills and sky-high grocery costs, local councils across the UK have been quietly setting up something that could drain hundreds more pounds from your bank account every single year. This isn't just another minor increase you can shrug off. We're talking about a financial tsunami that's about to crash into households from Cornwall to Scotland, and the timing couldn't be worse. Before we dive into exactly what's happening and why your bill is about to explode, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to Property Reporter so you never miss the latest UK property, economy and housing news that directly impacts your wallet. Trust me, you'll want to stay ahead of what's coming. Here's what nobody's telling you. Council tax bills across England are set to rise by an average of 5% in April, but that's just the beginning of the story. In real terms, we're looking at an extra £214 added to the average Band D property bill, pushing it to a staggering £2,428 per year. That's not a typo. Your local authority is about to reach deeper into your pocket than ever before, and they're doing it with the government's blessing. The Social Market Foundation has been crunching the numbers, and what they've found should terrify anyone who owns or rents property in this country. But here's where it gets really interesting. This isn't just about councils being greedy or wasteful. Local authorities are completely broke, and I mean genuinely running on empty. Over the past 14 years, government funding to councils has been slashed by a massive £40 billion when you account for inflation. Think about that for a second. £40 billion stripped away from the very organisations responsible for keeping your streets clean, your bins collected, your libraries open, and your social care running. Birmingham, one of the biggest cities in the country, has already declared itself effectively bankrupt. Nottingham followed suit. Woking, Thurrock, Croydon, Slough, the list keeps growing. These aren't small rural councils struggling to make ends meet. These are major population centres collapsing under financial pressure, and your council could be next. The government has basically told councils they can raise council tax by up to 5% without needing to hold a referendum, and you better believe almost every single one of them is going to max out that increase. Why wouldn't they? They're desperate. The alternative is cutting services even more dramatically than they already have, and there's barely anything left to cut. Libraries have closed, youth centres have vanished, road maintenance has become a joke, and social care services are hanging by a thread. When councils do try to save money by cutting services, residents rightfully complain. But when they raise taxes to maintain what little remains, those same residents are furious. It's a no-win situation, and you're caught right in the middle of it. Now here's the part that should really make your blood boil. Council tax is fundamentally broken as a system, and everyone knows it. The property valuations that determine which band you fall into haven't been updated since 1991 in England and 1993 in Scotland. Let that sink in. Your bill is based on what your property was worth over 3 decades ago when John Major was Prime Minister, the Soviet Union still existed, and the internet was barely a thing. The housing market has transformed completely since then, with some areas seeing property values skyrocket while others have stagnated, yet the tax bands remain frozen in time. This means massive inequalities where someone in a house now worth £800,000 might pay the same council tax as someone in a property worth half that, simply because both were valued similarly 30 years ago. Experts have been screaming about this for years, but no government has had the courage to tackle it. Why? Because updating the valuations would create millions of winners and losers overnight, and the losers would be furious. Imagine opening a letter telling you your council tax is doubling because your property has increased in value, even though you haven't seen a penny of that increase unless you sell. Politicians know this would be electoral poison, so they kick the can down the road year after year while the system becomes more unfair and more disconnected from reality. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation has pointed out that council tax takes a bigger chunk of income from poorer households than wealthy ones, making it one of the most regressive taxes in the UK. Someone struggling to pay rent in a Band A property pays a higher percentage of their income than a millionaire in a Band H mansion, and that's somehow considered acceptable. Meanwhile, the demands on council services keep exploding, especially in social care, The number of elderly people needing support is rising dramatically as the population ages, and councils are legally obligated to provide care to those who need it most. Adult social care now eats up a massive portion of council budgets, crowding out everything else. Children's services are similarly stretched, with councils having to support more vulnerable kids than ever before. The cost of temporary accommodation for homeless families has gone through the roof as the housing crisis deepens. Councils are literally paying extortionate rates to private landlords and hotel owners to house families who have nowhere else to go. And that money has to come from somewhere. Special educational needs support has seen demand surge, with parents fighting for their children to get the help they're legally entitled to, while councils struggle to fund it. All of this is mandatory spending. Councils can't just decide not to do it, so when the money doesn't cover costs, everything else gets sacrificed. Here's what makes this even worse. The government recently announced additional funding for local authorities, which sounds good until you read the fine print. Much of that extra money comes with strings attached, earmarked for specific purposes that don't necessarily match what councils desperately need. It's like being given a gift card to a shop you never use while your rent is overdue. The Local Government Association has calculated that councils face a funding gap of billions of pounds over the next few years, even with the announced increases, meaning services will continue to deteriorate and council tax will keep climbing regardless. This isn't a one-year problem that gets solved. This is the new normal, a relentless cycle of rising bills and declining services that's only going to get worse unless something fundamental changes. Some areas are going to be hit far harder than others, and it might not be what you expect. Rural councils often struggle more than urban ones because they have huge geographic areas to cover with smaller populations to tax. Collecting bins across hundreds of square miles of countryside costs way more per household than doing it in a dense city, but the council tax base is much smaller. Coastal towns that were once thriving seaside resorts now have ageing populations with high care needs and declining economic bases, creating perfect storms of demand and limited revenue. Former industrial areas that never fully recovered from manufacturing decline face similar challenges. These places are caught in doom loops where struggling economies mean lower property values and less council tax revenue, which leads to worse services, which makes the areas less attractive, which further weakens the economy. Breaking that cycle requires investment that neither local nor national government seems willing or able to provide. Property owners aren't the only ones who should be worried about this. If you're renting, these increases are almost certainly going to get passed on to you either directly or indirectly. Landlords pay council tax on empty properties and factor it into their cost for furnished lets where it's included. Even if you pay council tax separately as a tenant, rising bills squeeze household budgets, putting upward pressure on everything else. Students in shared houses, young professionals scraping together rent, families already struggling with the cost of living, everyone is going to feel this. And if you're thinking about buying property, you need to factor in that council tax is only going to keep rising. That affordable house you're considering might not look so affordable when you're paying £3,000 a year in council tax in a few years' time, and it will keep climbing. The really scary part is that 5% might just be the beginning. Some councils are already asking the government for permission to raise bills even higher through special dispensation. Thurrock, drowning in debt from disastrous investments, wanted to increase council tax by 10%. Others are considering similar requests. The government has said these will be dealt with on a case-by-case basis, but if they start granting exceptions, it opens the floodgates. Your council could suddenly announce not a 5% increase, but 7, 8, or even 10% if they can make a case for financial hardship, and given the state of local government finances, making that case isn't exactly difficult. There's no guarantee that the 5% cap will hold, and there's every reason to believe it won't. So, what can you actually do about this? Here's the frustrating reality. Not much. Council tax is unavoidable if you own or rent property. You can check whether you're in the correct band because about 400,000 properties in England are thought to be in the wrong band. But be warned that challenging your banding can result in it going up as well as down if the valuation goes against you. You can make sure you're claiming any discounts you're entitled to. like the 25% single-person discount or exemptions for full-time students. You can apply for council tax support if you're on a low income, which can reduce your bill significantly, but many people who qualify don't claim it because they don't know it exists. Beyond that, you're stuck paying whatever your council decides to charge within the limits the government sets. Voting might feel like an option, but here's the thing. Whoever you vote for locally is going to face the exact same financial constraints. A different party running your council would still be dealing with 14 years of funding cuts and surging demand for services. They might prioritise spending differently, maybe protecting libraries while cutting something else, or focusing on road repairs over public events. But the fundamental problem remains. There simply isn't enough money to do everything that needs doing, and council tax increases are inevitable, regardless of who's in charge. National elections matter more for this issue than local ones, because only the government can change the funding formula and fix the broken system. But that requires political will that's been absent for decades. Some people are calling for a complete overhaul of local government funding, scrapping council tax entirely and replacing it with something fairer. Ideas include a proportional property tax based on current values that would update automatically, or funding councils primarily through national taxation rather than local property taxes, or giving councils more powers to raise revenue through local sales taxes or tourist levies. Each option has pros and cons, winners and losers, and none of them are politically easy. The reality is that property taxation is relatively efficient to collect and hard to evade compared to other taxes, which is why governments love it despite its unfairness. Any replacement would need to raise similar amounts of money while being more equitable, and designing such a system that wouldn't create a massive political backlash is incredibly difficult. What's really telling is how little attention this issue gets despite affecting every household in the country. When income tax rises by a penny in the pound, it's front-page news for days. When fuel duty goes up, there are protests and political uproar. But council tax quietly climbs year after year by percentages that compound into massive increases over time, and most people just grumble and pay up. Since 2010, council tax has increased by more than 30% even before this latest rise. That's way above inflation for most of that period, meaning it's taking a bigger and bigger bite out of household incomes, yet it barely registers in national political debates. Perhaps that's because it feels like a local issue rather than a national one. Or maybe it's because the increases happen in small annual chunks rather than one big shocking rise. The timing of this particular increase is especially brutal given everything else squeezing household finances right now. Energy bills have come down slightly from their peak but remain far higher than a few years ago. Mortgage rates have climbed dramatically, pushing monthly payments up by hundreds of pounds for anyone remortgaging. Rents have surged across the country as the rental market tightens. Food prices have risen relentlessly. Petrol and diesel remain expensive. Wages have increased, but not nearly enough to keep pace with all these rising costs. Now add another 200 quid to your annual council tax bill, and for many families, that's the final straw that pushes budgets from tight to impossible. The Resolution Foundation has warned that living standards are set to fall for millions of households, and council tax increases are part of that squeeze. Looking ahead, there's absolutely no reason to expect council tax rises to slow down. The pressures facing local authorities are only going to intensify as the population continues ageing and demand for services grows. The government is unlikely to restore the £40 billion of funding that's been cut, especially given the state of national finances and competing demands from the NHS, defence, education, and everything else. Climate change is going to add new costs for councils dealing with flooding, extreme weather, and the need to retrofit buildings and transition to net zero. The housing crisis means more people needing temporary accommodation support. Benefits reforms and the cost of living crisis push more vulnerable people toward council services. Unless something dramatic changes at a national level, councils will keep maxing out whatever increases they're allowed to impose, and the government will keep raising those limits because the alternative is watching local authorities collapse. Some areas might even see councils effectively cease to function, leaving the government to step in with emergency commissioners to run essential services. We've already seen this happen where councils have gone bust. Birmingham is currently being run with government-appointed commissioners overseeing decisions and implementing massive cuts to balance the books. This isn't local democracy anymore, it's financial receivership. Residents lose control over local decisions, services get slashed to the bone, and the council becomes a shell of what it should be. That could be the future for dozens more authorities unless funding improves, and every time a council goes under, it sends shockwaves through the sector, making financial markets more nervous about lending to local government and pushing up borrowing costs for everyone. Here's something most people don't realise. Some of the financial disasters hitting councils weren't just bad luck or government underfunding. Some councils made spectacularly awful investment decisions trying to generate revenue to make up for funding cuts. Thurrock invested hundreds of millions in solar farms that turned out to be essentially worthless, leaving ratepayers on the hook for the losses. Woking borrowed billions for commercial property investments that went sour. Croydon made a series of risky property bets that failed. These weren't corrupt decisions necessarily, but they were desperate gambles by councils trying to plug funding gaps through commercial returns, rather than relying solely on government grants and council tax. When those gambles failed, ordinary residents ended up paying the price through even higher bills and even worse services. It's a reminder that the funding crisis has pushed local authorities into taking risks they should never have been taking. Even councils that managed their finances conservatively and avoided risky investments are struggling because the fundamental arithmetic doesn't work. You can't cut £40 billion from a system and expect it to deliver the same services. You can't demand councils provide adult social care, children's services, temporary housing, and special educational needs support while simultaneously reducing their funding in real terms. The numbers simply don't add up, and council tax increases are the pressure valve that prevents the whole system from exploding. But that pressure valve is being cranked tighter and tighter, and there's a limit to how much more households can pay before something breaks. We might already be reaching that limit in some areas where council tax arrears are climbing as people simply can't afford to pay. Enforcement of unpaid council tax is remarkably aggressive compared to other debts. Councils can get liability orders from magistrates' courts very quickly, add significant costs to your debt, send bailiffs to your home, take money directly from your wages or benefits, and even pursue imprisonment in extreme cases. Thousands of people appear in magistrates' courts every year for council tax debt, and while actual imprisonment is rare, the threat is real. The bailiff industry has boomed as councils desperately try to collect every penny they're owed, and the fees bailiffs can charge often push struggling households even deeper into debt. It's a nasty business that ruins lives, but councils feel they have no choice because every pound of unpaid council tax is a pound they can't spend on services. The generational unfairness of the current situation is staggering. Young people are being asked to pay more in council tax while receiving worse services than previous generations enjoyed. The libraries, youth centres, swimming pools, playing fields, and community facilities that boomers and Gen X took for granted have been closed or privatised. Road maintenance is so bad that potholes damage cars regularly. Meanwhile, a growing share of council budgets goes toward caring for the elderly, which is absolutely necessary and right, but it means younger residents pay more while getting less. Those trying to get on the property ladder already face sky-high house prices and massive deposits, and now they're looking at council tax bills that would have seemed unthinkable 20 years ago. It's another way in which the intergenerational contract has broken down, leaving younger people wondering what exactly they're paying for. The situation in Scotland and Wales is somewhat different but faces similar pressures. Scotland has had a council tax freeze or cap in various forms for years, which sounds good until you realise it means services have been cut even more dramatically to compensate. Welsh councils have slightly different rules but face the same funding crunch and rising demand. Northern Ireland uses a rates system rather than council tax, but the principle is similar, and the financial pressures are comparable. Nowhere in the UK has found a magic solution to funding local services adequately while keeping property taxes reasonable. It's a problem affecting the entire country, and the devolved nations are learning that controlling council tax rises just means the pain shows up elsewhere in reduced services and struggling councils. Business rates are another part of this puzzle that deserves mention. Commercial properties pay business rates rather than council tax, and this revenue is crucial for councils. But high streets are dying, retail units are closing, and business rates revenue is declining in many areas just when councils need it most. The shift to online shopping has devastated the commercial property tax base in town centres across the country. Empty shops don't generate business rates, and struggling businesses get relief that reduces what they pay. This creates another vicious cycle where declining high streets mean less revenue, which means worse council services and less investment in making town centres attractive, which leads to further decline. The government has promised business rates reform for years, but meaningful change remains elusive, leaving councils stuck with a revenue source that's shrinking in much of the country. What would it actually take to fix this mess? Honestly, it would require a level of political courage and long-term thinking that seems completely absent from British politics right now. It would mean having an honest national conversation about what we expect councils to do and how we're willing to pay for it. It would mean reforming council tax properly with updated valuations and probably moving to a more proportional system based on current property values. It would mean properly funding social care nationally rather than expecting councils to bear the burden. It would mean accepting that decades of cuts have consequences and that restoring services requires significant investment. It would mean some people paying more in tax, particularly those with valuable properties who've benefited from decades of frozen valuations. No government wants to touch this with a 10-foot pole because the political risks are enormous and the benefits wouldn't be felt until after the next election. So instead, we get this slow-motion crisis where bills keep rising, services keep declining, and everyone complains, but nothing fundamentally changes. Your council tax is going up by 5% this April, and it'll probably go up by another 5% next April and the April after that. In 10 years, you could easily be paying 50% more than you are now, even if inflation stays relatively low. Services will continue to deteriorate. More councils will go bust. The inequality and unfairness of the system will become more pronounced. And politicians will keep promising to look into it while doing absolutely nothing meaningful because actually fixing it would be too difficult and too risky. The really depressing part is how predictable all of this was. Experts were warning a decade ago that cutting council funding so dramatically would lead exactly here. They predicted the social care crisis, the rising homelessness costs, the infrastructure decay, the service collapse, and the inevitable council tax increases. None of this is a surprise to anyone who is paying attention. But short-term political priorities and austerity ideology trumped long-term planning, and now we're all living with the consequences. Your exploding council tax bill is the direct result of choices made in Westminster over the past 14 years. Choices to prioritise deficit reduction over public services, choices to protect wealthy homeowners from revaluation, choices to push costs onto local authorities without giving them the resources to cope. If you're sitting there thinking, this can't go on forever, you're right. Something will eventually have to give. Either funding will increase significantly, or services will collapse entirely in some areas, or council tax will rise so high that it triggers a real political crisis and forces reform. The question is, how much pain has to happen before we reach that breaking point? How many more councils have to go bankrupt? How many more libraries have to close? How many more roads have to become undrivable? How high do bills have to go before the system breaks down completely, or the political will emerges to actually fix it? We're conducting a grand experiment in how little funding local government can survive on, and we're discovering the answer is not much. Your £200 council tax increase this year might not sound like much compared to the overall cost of living crisis, but it represents something more significant. It's a symptom of a broken system that's been papered over for years and is now falling apart. It's a sign that the way we fund local services in this country is fundamentally unsustainable. And it's a preview of what's coming, because this isn't the end of the rises. This is the new normal, and it's only going to get worse until something forces a reckoning. The council tax bomb isn't about to go off. It's been detonating in slow motion for years, and the explosion is only going to get bigger unless someone finally finds the courage to defuse it properly. And right now, There's absolutely no sign that anyone in power is willing to do what it takes.